Eruvin, Daf Tzadi Vav through Kuf Beis, on Daf Tzadi Vav, Tzadi Zayin. Gemara continues discussing Tefillin. On Daf Tzadi Vav, the Gemara brings disputes among the Tanaim about whether Shabbos and Yom Tov and Laila, nighttime, are Zman Tefillin, whether the mitzvah of Tefillin applies to Shabbos and Yom Tov and Laila. We paskin that Laila is actually Zman Tefillin, that the mitzvah of Tefillin does apply at night. Nevertheless, we don't wear tefillin at night because there was a concern of Chazal that a person might forget and fall asleep and do things that are disrespectful to tefillin. So in practice, we don't wear tefillin at night, but Laila is really Zman Tefillin. The halacha therefore is, if a person put on his tefillin during the day and then at night, he can really still wear them. It's halacha vein morin kain. We don't advertise this. The Mishnah Berurah explains you shouldn't do that in public, only in private. But in principle, Laila really is Zman Tefillin. However, Shabbos and Yom Tov are not Zman Tefillin at all. The Gemara brings two drashas. First, the Gemara brings miyamim yamima, yamim v'lo leilos, miyamim v'lo kol yamim, some days, not all days, not Shabbos and Yom Tov. Later, the Gemara brings a different drasha. V'hayol l'cha la'os al yadecha. Tefillin is a sign, an os. These days, Shabbos and Yom Tov don't need an os. They are an os. Therefore, you don't wear tefillin on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So Laila, as we said, we paskin is Zman Tefillin in principle. In practice, we don't wear tefillin at night. Shabbos and Yom Tov, meikra din, are not Zman Tefillin. Because of one of these drashas, Tosfos says the real drasha is the second drasha, that tefillin is an os, you don't need an os on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Therefore, Shabbos and Yom Tov are not Zman Tefillin. That's universally accepted. What is not universally accepted, of course, what is a great machlokes, is tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Tosfos, right here on the Gemara, brings a discussion about this. Tosfos says we could argue that Chol HaMoed should also not be Zman Tefillin, because why is Shabbos and Yom Tov an os? Either Tosfos says because of the prohibition against doing work, the Isser Malacha, that makes them an os, or because of the mitzvahs of Yom Tov, Matzah and Sukkah. Chol HaMoed, you have those as well. There's an Isser Malacha of Chol HaMoed. There's actually a debate in the Rishonim whether the Isser Malacha of Chol HaMoed is Daraisa or Darabanan, but according to some Rishonim at least, the Isser Malacha is Daraisa, so that can be an os. Tosfos says the Isser Malacha is an os, and the mitzvahs of Matzah and Sukkah apply on Chol HaMoed. So that's an os as well. So Tosfos says you could have argued that you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed because Chol HaMoed is also an os. Tosfos' conclusion is, based on Yerushalmi, based on a raya from a Gemara in Be'ah, that Chol HaMoed is Zman Tefillin, and that is the ruling of the Ashkenazim, that Chol HaMoed is Zman Tefillin, you need to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. Beis Yosef says the minhag of Sfard, Kol B'nai Sfard, is not to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. He says he heard they also used to wear tefillin, like the Ashkenazim did, like the Rosh says, until they saw the Zohar. They discovered the Zohar. The Zohar, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, talks about what a terrible thing it is to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So the Sfardim stopped wearing tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Shulchan Aruch paskins, as per the Sfardim, that we don't wear tefillin on, it's usher to wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed as well. And the Ramah says, Yesh Omrim, that we do wear tefillin. And that's the minhag, he says, B'chol Klilos Elu in Ashkenaz, that we do wear tefillin. That was the minhag for centuries. Sfardim, following the Zohar, did not wear tefillin. Ashkenazim, following the Balei Tosfos, did wear tefillin. The Aruch HaShulchan, in the 20th century, says that this was the custom traditionally, that Sfardim did not and Ashkenazim did. Aruch HaShulchan adds that more recently he says many Ashkenazim don't wear tefillin either, by which he probably means the Hasidim, who stopped wearing tefillin, also following the Zohar. And the other group that doesn't wear tefillin is those who follow the Gra. The Gaon of Vilna also held that Chol HaMoed is Lav Zman Tefillin, so the followers of the Gra also don't wear tefillin. So that's why in Eretz Yisrael, where the Hasidim are influential, the Sfardim are influential, the followers of the Gra are influential. In Eretz Yisrael, it's apparently the dominant custom is very much not to wear tefillin. In Chutz La'aretz, in the US, for example, they're minhagim both ways. Sfardim don't, Hasidim don't, traditional Ashkenazim do. Some Ashkenazim who follow the Gra also don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed. The Mishnah Berurah discusses, Rishonim already debated whether those who do wear tefillin, do you make a bracha? Don't you make a bracha? Do you make the bracha quietly? Mishnah Berurah says the Achronim, the consensus of the Achronim is you should rather not make a bracha because it's a suffix. Some Rishonim say you're not chayev. Suffix bracha is lahakel. And the Gaon, in particular, the Gaon says that there's no mitzvah of tefillin on Chol HaMoed. So better to avoid the bracha. You want to wear tefillin, but you should not make a bracha on them. Mishnah Berurah also suggests that if you wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, you should make a t'nai. You should say, if If Chol HaMoed is man tefillin, I hereby put them on l'shem mitzvah. If Chol HaMoed is not man tefillin, if I'm not chayev, I'm not putting them on l'shem mitzvah. By doing that, he says, you avoid both problems. The problem of Bal Tosif. One reason not to wear tefillin if you're not chayev, dafka not to wear tefillin is Bal Tosif. Doing a mitzvah beyond where the Torah obligates you to is Bal Tosif. It's an avera. Also, it's a zilzul. It's not respectful to the oaths of Shabbos and Yom Tov to wear tefillin. Neither of those considerations apply. He says if you do it not l'shem mitzvah, if you make it t'nai that it shouldn't be l'shem mitzvah, there's no Bal Tosif because you're not doing it l'shem mitzvah, and there's no zilzul. There's no disgrace for the oaths of Shabbos because you're doing it not for the mitzvah. That's what the Mishnah Berurah recommends. Mishnah Berurah also says that in the same shul you shouldn't have some people wearing tefillin and some people not wearing tefillin. He brings B'Shem the Achronim that you shouldn't have some people doing it and some people not doing it. That would violate the prohibition of lo sisgodedu. The Torah says lo sisgodedu. Literally that means don't cut yourself, mutilate yourself. Chazal darshan means you shouldn't have agudos. You shouldn't have factions and become balkanized and having different people doing things. You're allowed to have different minhagim. You're allowed to have different cities have different minhagim. Even different shuls in the same city could have different minhagim. It says you can have two batei din be'erachas, two different batei din, two different traditions, two different sub-communities, each following their own tradition. But in one shul, you can't have people doing different things because that would be lo sisgodedu, and that is the position of the Aruch HaShulchan as well. But Beis Medrash Echad, in one shul, lo sisgodedu means you can't have some doing one way and some doing the other way. Rabbi Chaim Jachter has an article on this topic where he notes that in America there are some places that follow this. There are some places that say we have a separate minyan for tefillin or behind in the Ezras Nashim. There are some shuls that do this, but other shuls, people just do whatever they want. You have the same minyan with some people doing tefillin, some people doing no tefillin. That seems to be in violation of the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan. Rabbi Jachter argues that he tries to defend the custom. He says that historically, traditionally, minhagim were better defined. Places had a minhag, so if there was one place that had people doing different things, that's lo sisgodedu. In America, the melting pot, or Moshe Feinstein says in other contexts, we have all kinds of people from different cities with different minhagim. Everyone does what he wants, and there's no lo sisgodedu because America is one giant situation of shnei batei dinim, more than shnei batei dinim be'erachas. Therefore, Rabbi Jachter says perhaps you can argue that even if the poskim in Europe said there's supposed to be one minhag and having people doing both ways would be lo sisgodedu, in America things are different because everything is all mixed together anyway. Rabbi Jachter says if you go to Israel, he says, and put on tefillin there because there's such a overwhelmingly dominant custom not to wear tefillin. If you go ahead and put on tefillin following your minhag, that, he says, would be a violation of lo sisgodedu as per the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan. On Daf Tzadi Zayin, the Gemara discusses the kesher shel tefillin. The Gemara says, kesher shel tefillin, the knot of the tefillin, is halach l'Moshe Misinai. What does that mean? The Rashi says it means that we form the letters shin and dalet and yud out of different parts of the tefillin. The shin is pressed into the bias of the tefillin shel rosh. The dalet, the knot behind the shel rosh, is in the shape of a dalet, and the yud is a little part of the ritzua. The strap on the tefillin shel yad protrudes in a little piece. That's the shape of the yud. Those are the three letters of shin and dalet and yud. The name shakai, and that's what the Gemara means. Halach Moshe Misinai. Those various knots, the shel rosh dalet and the shel yad yud, and the shin, those are halach Moshe Misinai. Tosfos disagrees. Tosfos says the only one of those three letters that it's halach Moshe Misinai is the shin. That's a proper shin, a fully formed shin engraved into the bias. The dalet and the knot of the shel rosh and the yud and in the knot of the shel yad, those are not full blown letters. He says the Gemara never calls those halach Moshe Misinai. Might be a minute to do that. He says that's not halach Moshe Misinai. Beis Yosef brings the debate. He says the Torah paskins like Rashi, and the Shulchan Aruch seems to paskin like Rashi. The Shulchan Aruch talks about making these letters. He says we make the three letters of shakai. Doesn't say it's halach Moshe Misinai, but the Mishnah Berurah brings, there are some poskim who say that he brings from the El Yerabah. There was once a case of after a fellow took off his tefillin, he realized that he didn't have the yud. The yud knot wasn't tied on. You have to put on tefillin again. Mishnah Berurah explains it's halach Moshe Misinai. It's not just a minhag. It's not just a chumrah. It's halach Moshe Misinai. You have to have those three letters. If you didn't have the yud, you have to put on your tefillin again. So we're machmer l'chatchila certainly that we treat these letters as important. And we have all three of them, the shin and the dalet and the yud, that we have them in the tefillin in the various places. Mishnah Berurah brings as in machlokes, we say that the knot on the back of the shel rosh is supposed to be a dalet. Again, Tosfos says it's not a fully formed dalet, but it's kind of like a dalet. It's kind of like a right angle thing. Some people actually make a right angle, kind of like an inverted L-shaped knot. Other people make a square, a complete box out of and they call that $2. It's two different L-shaped pieces put together to form a square. There are different minhagim. The Mishnah Berurah says that he brings from the Sefer Tiferes Aryeh, that brings from the Sefer Tshuva Me'ava, and they both agree that Ladina, the real dalet, is better than the double dalet, but again, there are minhagim that go both ways. On Daf Tzadi Ches, the Gemara brings 3 halachos about showing proper respect for Svarim. Ein mizarken kisvei HaKodesh, we don't throw Svarim. That's something which we're pretty careful about, we don't throw Svarim. The Gemara brings 2 other halachos, though, which people are often less careful about. The Gemara is talking about somebody who was reading a sefer on a roof and it fell down. So the Gemara says that if it's within 10 tefachim, you can pick it back up. It's not hotzah. If it's more than 10 tefachim, then if it's more than 10 tefachim, it's a problem of hotzah. In certain cases, it's a problem of hotzah. Once it gets within 10 tefachim, I think, of the ground, then it's a problem of hotzah. So you can't pick it back up. So what do? So the Gemara says that since you can't pick it up, you have to leave it there. You turn it around so the letters face the wall instead of the letters being just exposed to every passerby on the street. The Gemara says, how are you allowed to do that? I mean, how are you allowed to turn tefillin facing the wall? It says when you write a sefer and you want it to dry, and you can't just turn it face down on the table. It's disrespectful to a sefer to put it face down on the table. So you have to leave it face up. You can cover it if you want, cover it with a garment, it says. But you can't turn a sefer face down onto a table. The Gemara says, here, there's no choice. If you don't turn the sefer facing the wall, you leave it just exposed to everywhere. That's more of a bizayon. So leaving the sefer just open and exposed is more of a bizayon. So the Gemara tells us that besides throwing svarim, there are 2 other types of conduct that are considered bizayon for the sefer. Leaving it exposed and open is a bizayon. Normally, turning it face down is also a bizayon, but turning it face down is less of a bizayon than leaving it just open and exposed, letting it just stay there. We pass in all 3 of these in Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim. You can't throw svarim, the Shulchan Aruch says, and also you're not allowed to turn a sefer on its face. The Gemara is talking about probably a real sefer Torah, there's something written on cloth and so on, but the Achronim say that these prohibitions apply to what we call svarim as well, our svarim, printed svarim on paper. So the Ramah says that you're not allowed to turn a sefer on its face, and if you find a sefer on its face, you have to put it back right side up. And those who write svarim, and they want it to dry, they can't turn them face down, even though it's for a good reason. They don't want the dust to get caught in the wet ink. However, it's a bizayon. You should leave it face up, and you should cover it with a garment, as the Gemara says. The poskim say, the Shach and the Taz bring the Bach, that this idea that leaving the sefer, the reason in the time of the Gemara they have to turn it toward the wall, they don't want to leave the sefer out facing everyone. The Bach says that a person who's learning can't just leave the sefer open and go outside leaving a sefer open unless you cover it with some kind of sheet. That it's not lav dafka sefer Torah, it applies to all svarim. You can't just leave a sefer open and exposed. There's a raya from Yerushalmi, there's a raya from Argamar. Leaving a sefer open is a bizayon. It's more of it, and it's even better than to turn the sefer toward the wall. But certainly you shouldn't just leave the sefer open. So we pass in both these halachas that Achronim bring. You can't just leave a sefer open when you're not learning from it, and you can't put a sefer face down. You can't turn a sefer face down. The Shach brings that there is a malach who's called Shin Daled. It stands for Shomer Dafin, he who guards the pages. If you leave the sefer open and you walk out, it's going to cause you to forget your learning. The Chida says even in his time, people are not so particular about this today. Even in his time, he says people about putting the sefer face down. He says the other halacha, people often did that when somebody was learning and they called him up for an aliyah. He would put his chumash face down. People do it with a siddur. You put your siddur face down when you step away from it. If the binding is tight, the pages won't stay open. People just put the siddur face down to keep their place. So the chumash, the ilmi says people put it face down. Chida says it's a terrible thing. They masidim litain es hadin. They're going to be punished for this. L'chichim yinam. That it's a mitzvah to reprove such people. You're not allowed to put a sefer face down. That if you do see a sefer put face down, you should pick it up. You see a sefer upside down, you should pick it up, and so on. Contemporary posts can also say people put a siddur upside down. You're not allowed to do that. You should use a bookmark if you have to. He says. Rabbi Yirmiyahu Keganov says, put a bookmark. You don't have a bookmark? Tough. He says you can't put a sefer face down. This is something that is very widespread. People do this all the time with siddurim, with benchers, with other svarim. Perhaps there is a limud chus, but many of the Gedolei Achronim, the Chida, were quite strict about this and say a person should never put a sefer face down, even for a relatively brief period. Other halacha, a person shouldn't leave a sefer open and walk away from it. So the poskim give various dispensations. Some people say that if someone is there, if someone's still there with the sefer, even if you're the one learning and you walk out, but if someone's there, it's okay. Other poskim say, although it does apply to other svarim, like Gemaras and svarim that we use, so you have to do one of these things. You should close it or put a sheet on top. Aruch HaShulchan says that is the minhag. We're careful about this. However, he gives you a couple of dispensations. He says that's when you're actually leaving, you're completely leaving and going out. If you're just going from one room to another, you go to the bathroom or something else, you're just going from one room to the other, or even if you're going outside, he says, but it's not for a long time, then it's okay. So that's a major dispensation. If you're just going out briefly, or to another room, maybe even more than briefly, Aruch HaShulchan says his basis for leniency. Similarly, the Sefer Avnei Yashveh, he also says this. He says that if a person is going out for a brief period of time, you can leave a Sefer open. But if you're a Mesiach Das, you're going out for a longer period of time, you really can't leave a Sefer open. People sometimes in yeshiva, when they want to reserve a seat, they take their Sefer, they open it, and then they go out and come back when they're ready to start learning. Rabbi Frank Greenblatt talks about this. He says a person shouldn't really do that. Maybe he says it's okay because it saves time, it avoids having to waste time looking for a chair or a stender, he says. But maybe there's a justification for it, but it should only be the Sefer you're actually going to learn from, not just a random Sefer. Other posts can disagree and say you shouldn't do this, he says. But what might be okay is if you don't open the Sefer all the way. This is what I think most people do. You just open it to the flyleaf inside, and the Sefer is not really open, so that's better. On Daf Tzadi Tes and Daf Kuf, Mishnah at the end of Tzadi Tes, the Gemara and Daf Kuf, the Gemara talks about sitting on trees, sitting on roots of trees, and so on. There's a halacha we had back in Shabbos. You're not allowed to mishtamesh be'ilan. You're not allowed to use or climb or rest things on a tree on Shabbos. Gzeira, you might break off branches. So the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, you're not allowed to sit on the roots of a tree, the roots that protrude from the ground, if they're within that if they're 3 tfachim or more above the ground, then you're not allowed to sit on them. Within 3 tfachim of the ground, it's nothing. Once they reach 3 tfachim, which is not that high, you're not allowed to sit on those roots. That's how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Berurah talks about bushes. That's about roots of trees. What about low bushes? Bushes that have fruits or vegetables, different types of low shrubbery. Can you sit on those? So first he says that if it's less than 3 tfachim, he says these are not real trees. He says you'd be allowed to. Then he says no, maybe bushes are even worse than trees because they have fruits. He says there's even more of a gzeira. You might pick off a fruit. Maybe bushes are maybe bushes is even more of a problem. He says even less than 3 tfachim, maybe bushes is a problem. First, he suggests bushes even more than 3 tfachim might be okay because the issur is on trees, not on bushes. Then he says the other way, maybe bushes, especially those that have fruits, are more chamer. Even less than 3 tfachim is a problem. Sitting on anything potentially could be a problem. Even bushes, certainly if they're fruit things that have that could be a problem. Even less than 3 tfachim. What about tree stumps? You want to sit on a tree stump? The Aruch HaShulchan says he didn't find an explicit discussion about tree stumps, but he says that first he says it should be asur. Even if you cut the tree, it's still a tree. It's more than 3 tfachim off the ground. The stump, as long as it's 3 tfachim high off the ground, it should be asur. But then he says that's only if you cut it, you pruned it, and you want it to grow back. You cut off some of the branches, and the remainder is supposed to grow back. That's going to be asur. He says it's still a tree. But if you cut it because you don't want it, you cut it to get rid of it, he says, even if it's 3 tfachim high, then it's just wood. It's not a tree anymore. It's not considered a tree. And then he says that's what he thinks. He doesn't have proof, he says. He doesn't have a concrete source. That's what he thinks. If you cut it down for the purpose of getting rid of it, you can sit on the remaining stump. That's what the Aruch HaShulchan says. Reb Ben Zion Abba Shaul in the Or L'Tzion, he says you may not sit on a tree stump, he says if it's yonek min hakarka. I'm not sure if he means it's actually still alive and deriving nourishment, but he says you can't sit on the stump, not like the Aruch HaShulchan though, he says, at least in the case where it's still growing and nourishing and receives nourishment from the ground, but you cannot sit on tree stumps. But Daniel Nustat brings these 2 opinions. He says sitting on a dead tree stump, he says, some posts can say mutter, some posts can say asur. Mishnah Berurah is not clear. He seems to understand that Rabbi Abba Shaul is prohibiting sitting even on a dead stump, so that's machlokes with no clear resolution in the later posting. The Gemara in Daf Kuf also talks about walking on grass. The Gemara talks about a question of whether walking on grass, you may rip out the grass, and maybe that's asur. The Gemara brings different distinctions, whether you're wearing shoes or barefoot, whether your shoes have spikes or the grass is long. The Gemara brings different distinctions. But lahalacha, we don't paskin like those distinctions. The end of the Gemara, we say, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon, Dover Shem Miskavin. We had this a number of times in Masechah Shabbos. Davar Shem Miskavin is mutter. If you do a malacha on Shabbos, even if there's a good chance you may do it, if you don't intend to do it, it's mutter. As long as it's not a psik reisha, as long as it's not inevitable, it's mutter. So walking on the grass, you may pull out some grass, but you may not. It's not a psik reisha, and therefore walking on grass is mutter. That's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, wet grass, dry grass, doesn't matter as long as it's not your intention. Therefore, it is mutter. The Mishnah Berurah brings from the Smag, the Bria Halacha, the Mishnah Berurah bring from the Smag. The Smag seems to say that it's aser. That in certain cases it's aser. The Mishnah Berurah explains that even though the Gemara says it's mutter because we pass like Rabbi Shimon, Davar Shem Miskavin is mutter, it's mutter so long as it's not a psik reisha. But if the grass is long enough, if the grass is long grass and you're going to run and in a way that it is a psik reisha, then it's aser. The Gemara just meant in the standard case, in most scenarios of grass, it's mutter. But if you find a case, long grass and running where you definitely will rip out the grass, then it's a psik reisha, and then it's aser. Aruch HaShulchan disagrees. Aruch HaShulchan says, the Gemara says it is always mutter, there are no distinctions, full stop. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's mutter. The Aruch HaShulchan, in a relatively uncommon thing, he brings the Mishnah Berurah, not by name, but he says, Re'isi Misha Machmer, I saw a certain sefer that's stringent about this. He says, it's not correct, we don't make up our own isurim. The Gemara says mutter. You found a strange comment in the Smag, it's not la halacha. The Gemara says mutter, we don't worry about it. Not really sure what they're arguing about. If it is a psik reisha, why shouldn't it be aser? If it's not a psik reisha, why should it be aser? It seems to be largely a factual question. Is it a psik reisha or not? But nevertheless, it's a machlokas, Mishnah Berurah and Aruch HaShulchan. If the grass is really long and you're running and you think it's a psik reisha, the Mishnah Berurah says then it's aser. The Aruch HaShulchan says then it is mutter. Rabbi Newstead again brings that it's a machlokas in this case. If you think it's a psik reisha, then it's a machlokas. Mishnah Berurah also says that if you do uproot grass, it was mutter, it wasn't a psik reisha, but some grass got stuck to your shoe, that grass is muktzah. So you're not allowed to pull the grass off your shoe, the grass is muktzah. So you can rub it off with your other foot or something, like you can handle muktzah, but the grass is muktzah, so you can't remove it from your shoe as per the laws of muktzah. On Daf Kuf Aleph, Mishnah talks about a certain case of using keys on Shabbos. So without getting into the details of the keys, the Gemara discussing that Mishnah, the Gemara says there's a difference between Rishus HaRabim and Carmelis. The Gemara says that the prohibition would apply in a bona fide Rishus HaRabim, but Yerushalayim is actually only a Carmelis. Why? So the Gemara says Yerushalayim really should have been Rishus HaRabim. It had enough people. If you need 600,000, apparently it had 600,000. But because it had doors that were closed at night, we had the discussion of doors back in the first parak on Daf Vav. Because it had doors that were closed at night, therefore it's not a Rishus HaRabim, it is only a Carmelis. Some posts can actually prove from Yerushalayim that it was considered a Rishus HaRabim, if not for the doors, even though Rav Chaim Ozer says, Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski says, there was no one street that had Shishim Ribu, it's enough to have 600,000 in the whole city. So Paris should also be Rishus HaRabim by that logic. But the Gemara says, because it had doors, the doors were closed at night, it was not a Rishus HaRabim, but it was a Carmelis. Apparently it was usher to carry in Yerushalayim. Why was it usher to carry? If it had doors that were closed at night, why was it like a Carmelis? Rashi is not so clear. Rashi says two different things. One line in Rashi, he calls it was like a Chater Shelo Eruvu. There were a lot of people who lived in Yerushalayim. They had to make a Shitufei Mavos or Eruvin Chateris, and there was no Eruv. That kind of Eruv. So it had proper fences, but they didn't make the Eruvin Chateris or Shitufei Mavos. Other part of Rashi is mashma that inherently it couldn't have an Eruv. Even though Midaraisa, the fences were good, but Midrabanan had the din of a Carmelis, the fences still weren't good enough. Not so clear why that would be, but that's the Rambam has such a shita apparently that it wasn't possible to make a full Eruv in Yerushalayim for his reason. But the post can discuss, beginning with the Tosfos Yantov and the Tiferes Yisrael, and going down to Rav Moshe and Rav Menashe Klein in the 20th century. Poskim are very struck by this. Why didn't they make an Eruv in Yerushalayim? Assuming they could, why didn't they? We had earlier in the Masechta that the Amoraim were puzzled, a Mavoy, an alley that has Amoraim in it has Gedolei Torah. How could they not have an Eruv? It's a mitzvah to make an Eruv because people shouldn't carry by mistake. So why didn't they make an Eruv in Yerushalayim? So the post can give different reasons. It's Tiferes Yisrael. Tiferes Yisrael says there were Tzedukim and Baitusim. We learned earlier in Eruvin that for those people, the Eruv doesn't work. You have to do Skiris Rishus, and they wouldn't cooperate. So poskim did give different reasons why they didn't do it. Some say maybe they just didn't do it. They didn't for some reason. But Rav Moshe is very puzzled by that. He says, surely they would have if they could. So why didn't they make an Eruv? Rav Moshe has a couple of suggestions, one of which he says is that in a big city, in a city that has people who come from all over, Yerushalayim, everyone came to be Ola Regel and to eat Maser Sheni there, he says, people travel from all over. If they would see people carrying in Yerushalayim, they would think that you're always allowed to carry. They wouldn't realize that Yerushalayim has a proper Eruv. So Moshe explains that they would come to carry in their cities that didn't have a proper Eruv, that couldn't have an Eruv, that didn't have an Eruv. Therefore, he says, Yerushalayim, even though they could have made an Eruv, they deliberately didn't to avoid causing people to be lax about the laws of Eruv. Moshe therefore says, therefore in Manhattan you shouldn't make an Eruv. Manhattan as well, he says, that it's a place people come from all over, and in some of those places you can't make an Eruv, he says. It's not practical, it's not possible, he says. And even near Yerushalayim, even near Manhattan, there are places that you can't have an Eruv. So if Manhattan would make an Eruv, even if it would be technically kosher, Moshe held there were also many problems with the kashrus of the Eruv. But besides that, he said, even if you could make an Eruv, you shouldn't, because the same reason they didn't have an Eruv in Yerushalayim, you shouldn't make an Eruv in Manhattan. Later in the tshuva, when he summarizes, he says maybe even in Brooklyn you shouldn't make an Eruv for the same reason, because people come from all over. Other poskim disagreed. Menashe Klein, who disagreed with everything Moshe wrote about the Eruv in Manhattan, tried to argue with him at great length and say that's not the pshat and why they didn't have an Eruv in Yerushalayim. But this was what Moshe said, that you see from the Gemara they didn't have an Eruv. Moshe proposes a couple of reasons. This is one reason, because it would cause people to be lax locally and where they couldn't make an Eruv. He brings another reason Moshe brings another reason possibly why they couldn't make an Eruv. He says that a place that really is a Rishus Harabim, even if it has walls, Midrabanan is still usher. Even though the walls work on a Daraisa level, Midrabanan he still can't make an Eruv. Most poskim don't go like that, but maybe there's such a shita, he says. That could be another reason why they didn't have an Eruv in Yerushalayim. So because of either of those reasons, he says, it would still apply to a city like Manhattan, a city that would have been a Rishus Harabim. Even if you make a proper Eruv, he says, you shouldn't do it because of the other reason, that it will lead people to be lenient where they can't make an Eruv. Maybe you really can't make an Eruv there. But poskim tried to learn certain chumras in Eruv from the fact that they didn't make an Eruv in Yerushalayim, even though they had these walls, they had these doors that were closed at night. Still, it seems they didn't make an Eruv, although it's not really clear exactly why. On Daf Kuf Beis, the Gemara has various halachos about ohel arai, making a temporary ohel. One of the halachos the Gemara brings is that if you already have an ohel that's one tefach and you're mosif, you add to it, that's okay. The Gemara has different cases. The Gemara says they had certain animals that during the day they needed shade from the sun, and at night they needed air. So they wanted to roll up the cover during the day and roll it and unroll it at night. So the answer was that if you leave over a tefach of the thing that you want to roll and unroll, you're allowed to roll it further, you're allowed to roll it back. As long as you leave one tefach unrolled, that's called being mosif alo alarai, adding or subtracting by rolling it back. That's okay, because a real ohel you can't do that too. Or if you build bricks, you can't add just because if you have one tefach of brick, you can't add another tefach of brick. But an ohel arai, a temporary thing that you roll back and forth, so adding is okay or subtracting is okay as long as you start with a tefach, as long as you already have a tefach that's out there. The Gemara has other applications of that. And that's what we paskin in Shulchan Aruch. If you have an ohel arai, you're allowed to extend it by rolling it out further. There's a major debate among contemporary poskim, 20th century poskim, about baby carriages. The baby stroller has an awning, a hood that folds out and folds back in. Unfolding that hood may very well be an ohel arai. You're making an ohel for the baby on Shabbos. So some poskim said, the Chazon Ish, and other poskim said it's not a problem, because that's like opening a door on Shabbos, opening a window. It's meant to be open and closed. That's not considered making something new. That's just the way the house works. That's just the way the door is meant to open and close. So it's not a problem at all. But other poskim, Rav Adi Yosef, Rav Moshe Feinstein, other poskim held that opening the awning of the stroller is a problem with making an ohel. So the solution they gave is that leave the hood open one tefach before Shabbos. Now opening it further is being mosif alo alarai, and that's okay. So to be machmer for this, you would make sure before Shabbos that the hood stays open at least one tefach and not to close it all the way. That's a tefach. But if you leave it open a tefach, then you can open it further, and that is okay. Other poskim say it's not a problem. It's just like opening and closing a door. You don't have to worry about it at all. Those poskim add, let's say you want to add to your stroller, you want to add a kind of a secondary net or another thing on top of the hood. You want to put that on top of the hood. So if the hood is currently closed and you want to take something like a mosquito net and put it on top of the stroller, that might again be considered making an ohel arai. So what they say you can do in that case is first open the hood, which they say you're allowed to do. And once the hood is open, then if you put the net on, even if it extends further, that's again being most about lowel. Even though it's a second piece, some posts can say that once the hood is open and you put on a further net or a further hood, you're just extending the open hood, and that's okay. Opening the hood, they say, is mutter because that's the built-in hood, because that's part of the stroller. And adding a second piece is also okay because once the hood is open, if you do it first, once the hood is open, then once the hood is open, then adding another piece is okay. But the poskim al machmer say that you really shouldn't open even the built-in hood. You shouldn't open it unless it's already open at tefach. And when you close it, also you shouldn't close it all the way. You should leave a tefach to avoid dismantling the ohel harai. Later on the daf, the Mishnah talks about if a bandage falls off a wound, are you allowed to put the bandage back on? The Mishnah says no. You're not allowed to put the bandage on anywhere, even in the Beis HaMikdash. If the bandage was on and fell off, in the Mikdash you can put it back. In the Medina, outside the Mikdash you can't. But outside the Mikdash in the Medina, in our case, you can either put the bandage on chatchila and you can't even return it if it fell off. The Gemara has more distinctions about if it fell off onto a keli or onto the ground. The way we paskin in Shulchan Aruch is if it fell off, you can't return it. If it fell onto a keli, you could return it. A non-Jew can return it. These halachas have to do with bandages that had ointments, that had some kind of medicinal salve on it. There was a concern of Shema Yimarech. Mishnah Berurah brings the concern is if you handle this bandage, they were afraid you might do something to smooth out and to properly arrange the cream on the bandage, and that would be to smooth it out, to make it even. That's a malacha deraisa of Yimarech. Our band-aids, what we call a band-aid, just an adhesive band-aid or other brand that you simply stick on, that's not what we're talking about here. That the poskim all say is fine. That is not that's not medicinal because it doesn't make it, assuming it's not a medicated bandage, it doesn't heal the wound. Healing itself would be a malacha of refuah, but if there's no medicine, it's just a bandage to keep it clean and keep dirt from getting in and keep it from rubbing and getting irritated. That's okay. That doesn't violate any of the that doesn't violate this whole isser, which is Shema Yimarech or the isser of refuah. That's not what we're talking about over here. So our kind of band-aid is fine. Post can discuss whether taking off the backing of that adhesive or tying that adhesive to the skin or to each other. There could be some post can worry in certain cases about isurim of tofer or kareah. But in terms of the isser of our Mishnah, the general consensus you can use a bandage onto skin. Better, some posts can say not to put the edges of the bandage onto. You shouldn't stick the bandage to itself. On skin, it's less of a problem. It's not really tofer on skin. But the concern of our Mishnah of Shema Yimarech does not apply. The other concern of we don't do any refuah on Shabbos, the Mishnah Berurah says we're talking about a bandage that was already on before Shabbos. That kind of bandage, in such a case, there was no gzeira of refuah. Again, our bandages, even if they weren't on before Shabbos, because they have no medicinal properties, they're just a simple barrier to keep it clean and to keep it from getting infected or getting injured. That kind of band-aid has nothing to do with our Mishnah. That kind of bandage is absolutely mutter. Again, putting aside other questions of tofer or kareah.